Hi, everybody. My name is David Leis, and I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier. And today, on December the 28th, 2023, it's hard to believe, 23, we will be going live here on X and, of course, on YouTube. And we're delighted to welcome our entire audience and our special guest today, Lee Harding, who's an accomplished writer and researcher. So, welcome, Lee.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to tell you, I'm supporting our boys over there in Europe right now. I hope we're going to win.
Well, that is great. I know that Lee, you are a sports fan, and you know a lot about the sports world, and we can maybe even talk about that a little bit today. But today we're going to talk about on December the 28th, 2023, the topic of hot topics from 2023, and maybe even reflect a little bit on 24 as we look to the turn of the new year. But we want to hear from you, the audience, in terms of your questions or your comments, in terms of what do you think were the top issues that you think not only our country faces, Canada, but also around the world stage. I mean, there's just so many issues, it's almost overwhelming. So I did want to mention a couple, whether it's the absurdity of aspects of our culture in Canada when we think about the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion movement. That's an interesting one. We have the terrorist attacks on October 7 by Hamas on Israel and all the kind of things that flew out of that kind of tragedy. We also have the state of law in our country, to the economy and the challenges of affordability in our country as people go to the grocery store and say, wow, I don't think I can afford to buy this anymore. We had all kinds of carbon tax debates. We have questions regarding Chinese or Communist Party influence in Canada, of course. And we have the so-called just transition to avoid a climate meltdown in Canada and all the associated costs with that. We've got censorship issues to still no information or data or evidence regarding mass graves that have been claimed by so many. I mean, the list goes on, Lee. So when you think about some key issues in your mind on the horizon 2023, what comes to your head, Lee, other than hockey teams?
Well, there are so many things going on. It is a very pivotal time for our country and for the whole world. One of the things that happened in this recent year, and I don't know if it's the most important, but when I look at things that represent a significant change, I think we've really seen a lot of movement in Canada against the carbon tax.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
who knows what will ride on the tails of that? I mean, we've just had the COP28 meetings in Dubai where they're talking about
Oh,
eliminating
what's the
gas-powered vehicles.
COP, Lee, for those acronyms?
Oh, I think it's the convention, and I'm not even sure what it is offhand.
Mhm.
I just know they're going to cop everything. They're going
But
to
it's
take away
the
all of our.
climate change summit with all the the good and the great flying in with their private jets to talk about climate
Yeah, it
change,
is.
right?
It is a convention. The
Mhm.
sea, and so what that brings together is the nations of the world under the auspices of the UN to try to come up with some kind of convention, some kind of agreement. I think it's convention on protocol, but it's an
Mhm.
agreement on how they're going to approach the questions at hand. So some of these are for climate. They have other COPs for other issues. But with this one, it is about climate change. And so there's been some kind of commitment even to eliminate fossil fuels in the long term, or at least discussion of it. A
Mhm.
lot of these are aspirational and they're very fuzzy on how they're going to get there, which is something that both opponents and proponents of what is going on there talk about. And that means that in the fuzziness, who knows what's really going to happen? And
Mhm.
I'm not sure that really any of this is going to help. I mean, especially Canada's participation, even though we're an industrial country, we only have 1.6% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So if
Mhm.
we all died and everything stopped breathing and there were no more cattle and there was no more industry, we it would not even barely make any kind of difference in the world. And
Wow.
but the world would sure miss our food. They would sure miss our oil and our gas, despite what they're trying to do. We're not ready to have a wholesale embrace of these alternate technologies. And
Hmm.
to go all electric right now would take such an enormous amount of resources. I can't even imagine how much mining and equipment to string up all of this wire and this and that would go on. And these are costs that, in a lot of the analyses, aren't really analyzed. There were a
Hmm.
couple of analyses going into the meetings, and from a cost benefit ratio, it didn't make sense. So these claims
Hmm.
that the economy is going to be helped by this kind of stuff, and if we don't, it's going to be economically worse. When you look at the long term, big picture of everything, it just does not add up.
Okay. So right off the top, then you'd say that the persistent claims and actions around climate alarmism is one of the big stories out of 2023 again. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, and I think we could anticipate that continuing to happen because there's
Mhm.
certain agendas at work. I think the elites really don't want to have common people prospering. It's just much easier to impose your designs on the whole world if you're controlling the energy and a lot of the means of its production, because from that you can control pretty much everything else. And of course, a lot of
Mhm.
the surveillance and data collection technologies have to have a consistent means to do that. And so if you electrify everything, that also makes that agenda a lot easier.
Okay.
So there's
So you're really
overlapping
taking, sorry, what was that, Lee?
goals here, and
Yeah.
you don't have to peel back too far to start seeing them revealed.
Okay. So, but what's interesting, Lee, is your take on that issue is you're flipping the narrative that it's all about saving the planet, that there's other agenda going on here. And I've known you for years, Lee. I know that you care deeply about the environment, but you're suggesting there's another set of agenda going on here. And so how would you describe that agenda?
Well, I think it's been expressed in some veiled ways through the years. One of the most interesting ones was the book in 1901 by H.G. Wells. It was called Anticipations. And in it, basically, H.G. Wells lays out how the next century should be. And as a middle class person, it doesn't really seem like these ideas are coming from him. And so we're not
Mhm.
sure if he ghost wrote for the elites or what happened. But in it, they talk about how, in the natural course of history, there's always been serfs and there's been rulers. And
Mm.
and that through the industrial revolution and population growth, that means of being in the world was changing. And they said if they did not intervene then, it could probably never be recovered. And so it explicitly talks about poisoning, about euthanasia, about re-education, about a world superstate,
Oh,
about
wow.
graduated income taxes, about central banks, about the roles of trust-funded organizations to remold the world. And so a lot of those things have taken place. Now, the superstate they hope for by the end of the century, and I guess the end of the millennium, that didn't happen. Now we've got goals for 2030, and they may or may not happen, goals for 2050 that may or may not happen. But the general bent is the same. I think, and you can look at most of the agendas that are being pushed now that rational people think make no sense. This paradigm, these kind of goals, start to give a framework where maybe we can understand a bit of what the end game is. We often hear Klaus Schwab, he's fond of saying this new stakeholder capitalism is going to be the greatest change since the Industrial Revolution. Well, if you look at a book like H.G.
Mhm.
Wells's, the Industrial Revolution, yes, it would be the greatest change because they would try to revert it all so that we are back
Mhm.
to a new serfdom. And you and I will be the
Okay.
serf.
Wow. So that's, Lee, you're really putting on the table, in many ways, what you think is, dare I say, the big issue, because there's so many agenda behind that. So what do you think, the audience? Do you think Lee is overstating that or understating it, or is he right on over the target? What do you think in terms of that kind of agenda? And what are the big topics that you've noticed in 2023? Certainly, that's a big one. I think related to this has to do with the topic, I would say, of the revelations regarding COVID-19 and the vaccines that continue to be a concern for many people. What are your thoughts on that, Lee?
Well, it's interesting looking now. I mean, in some ways, vaccines are a done issue for most people. It's like we had a pandemic, people got two. Most of the mandates have been lifted, although in some places against logic, and in some respects, they're still lingering, especially in British Columbia or for pilots or this sort of thing. Um, the more that we're finding out about this vaccine, the more we find out why you shouldn't rush a vaccine. And there are various mechanisms that they're finding. One of them is that the SV40 virus that is used to manufacture it, there's a process by which they can take that out after it's done its purpose in the mRNA development. But it seems like they didn't bother to do that. And according to Byron Bridle at the University of Guelph, he said basically you can do that. He said he had a master's student who that was one of the courses is you make an mRNA vaccine and or one of the projects at least, and you have a way to get rid of that stuff. So I mean, anyone can do it. He says it's not even a professional thing, and all the king's horses and all the king's men at Pfizer and Moderna should have figured that out. So it's, and in fact, that was not part of the disclosure by which they were approved, and so there could be some legal
so
challenges.
that is a big revelation. I think if you want to learn more about that as well, be sure to look at the report and the website of the National Citizens Inquiry. I think that the inquiry just came out a few weeks ago with its report. It's an amazing report that summarizes its finding, both in conversation with hundreds of persons through, like, Canadians, their experience with the management of COVID-19, but also experts. And I think one of their key warnings is that the vaccines are neither safe nor effective. They didn't stop the transmission of the virus. And as you're underlining, there's concerns about that they're unadulterated in the sense that they have contaminations in them of DNA, pardon me. And so in that context, it's something to very much look into and be aware of. So that's a key issue. What about this whole just transition? Lee, we talked about that. And I'm going to ask from a particular point of view, and that is the incredible subsidies that we see both federal and provincial governments throwing at the establishment of battery plants to electric vehicles. I mean, it's stunning. I mean, I look at the amount of money that was put by the federal government toward a company called Volkswagen as just one of many examples across the country. I think it's well over $24 billion. Does this surprise you? Do you think that's a big story that we're seeing?
I don't know if it surprises me or not. I don't like it. I don't think it's warranted. The case for corporate subsidies has always been really weak. It becomes a bidding war between other countries and who is willing to sell out their taxpayers the most for a multinational company for the alleged benefits that come about. It's just better to keep low income taxes, low business taxes, an educated workforce, and let them set up shop accordingly. And that's the way we should be approaching it. And the recent reports from the Parliamentary Budget Office suggest that because of certain changes in the states and incentives they're giving there, that it's delaying the recovery time for these subsidies. When you see all the trickle down economic effects, it's going to be in excess of a decade and even 2 decades, I think, for one of them before that money is actually recovered. So Canadians are not winning in these kinds of deals. Again, it gets back to this whole thing. It's almost like we have a world where the governments are not representing the people. They're representing certain elite interests, and their interests come at the extent of the people as they forward these green agendas.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And how does it involve common sense when you're putting that level of subsidy in facilities that really don't have any payback in the foreseeable future. It's almost bizarre. Um, the other question I had related to this is the state of the economy. Like, we have persistent inflation. We have a dollar that's continued to lose value. People go to the grocery store and they are just shocked by the cost of living. But that's only one small part of it. They also wonder about the renewal of their mortgage now. Um, they can barely, for many people, it's been a real stress when it comes to the economy. I've talked with uh, certainly realtor after realtor across the country, and they see a kind of a slowing of the market. It depends which market you're in specifically, but the affordability of housing in some markets is just atrocious. There's no hope of the next generation owning a home. I know that in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver, it costs approximately 12 to 14 times your family income to buy a home. So, Lee, where do you think our economy is now in Canada? It's a little bit confusing. Where as the stock market goes up, high inflation, low productivity, and declining productivity, where do you think the economy's at in Canada?
Well, it's in a precarious spot, and the government is basically using mass immigration to drive up demands, and with that, it drives up the cost of everything as well. And so there's certain inflationary pressures that it doesn't, the Bank of Canada and their monetary policy can't really put the toothpaste back in the tube if you're having 500,000 people come every year. There was a recent
Mhm.
analysis done by Derek Holt at Scotiabank where he said the immigration is going to drive the inflation of everything. And he says, I cannot tell you, oh, they're going to lower rates in the spring. He cannot see that happening. And he looks at some very
Mhm.
fundamental things that make perfect sense on that. So the affordability pressures won't go away. And the Liberal government is hell bent on these green goals that they're going to ramp up the carbon tax, the price per ton by $50 per ton every year through 2030, and then who knows where it goes from there.
Wow.
So in many places, people are recognizing that because the tax is applied not just to the consumption charges, but to the carriage costs. So, let's say it costs $100 a month to have your natural gas hooked up. You might only burn $25 in natural gas, but your carbon tax will be $36. So people are realizing they're actually paying more tax than product that they're getting.
Yeah.
And this should have them upset. And now we've seen that in Atlantic Canada, where the Liberals swept in 2015, there was a real backlash that was coming because the carbon tax was finally applying to them. The Ottawa said
Mhm.
your provincial plans aren't good enough. We're going to impose the carbon tax, just like the rest of the countries had, except for Quebec. And no, that's NBC because they're even more bent on this ideology. And when it finally started applying to them, oh my gosh, it's almost a revolt. And so then, oh, well, we're going to back
Yeah.
off for 3 years. So, yeah, the affordability issues, basically, we're all getting herded in a certain direction that they just hope we don't squawk or rebel too much. But it's,
Wow.
are we going to get pushed over the cliff slowly or quickly? Are we going to
So
push?
the passage of the so-called just transition bill is going to make things much worse in terms of carbon tax. I believe, if memory serves me correctly, it'll increase the amount of taxes on your fuel by at least 3 to 4 times over the next number of years. So they're really going, instead of backing off. This is my observation. Instead of hearing the concerns about affordability and carbon taxes. If anything, they're doubling down. This government seems to be, federally at least, really doubling down on that kind of transition. Is that your read on it as well?
Oh, absolutely, they are. And the problem is that even if there's a change of government, let's say we had 2 terms of a conservative government. Let's say we had 8 years. Oh boy, well, when it inevitably changed hands to Canada's natural governing party, the Liberals, they'll say, well, the Conservatives sure set us back a long way. Now we need to catch up and do the things that we pledged 10 years ago to do. And now we really got to,
Mhm.
ram that in. So it is a concern. And people are realizing, it's one thing to have a nice notion about helping the environment and whatnot, But when it becomes a practical reality is when people start realizing maybe this doesn't make so much sense, and maybe this
Yeah.
isn't, the immediate concern is whether I can house it, feed my family, and have something left at the end of it to save,
Mhm.
or regardless of some meteorological thing that maybe it's
Mhm.
going to help some.
Mhm. No, I think you're right, Lee. That's a very good point. I do have a question, and I do invite audience members to pose their questions or state their comments about what do you think are the key issues that have happened in 2023 or the ones that you anticipate in 2024. You're very welcome to pose your comments. We'd love to hear from you. So one of the questions I had was, do you think the parental rights movement made a difference in Canada? What are your thoughts, Lee?
Well, it did. Basically, we saw a lot of transgender agendas go on unchallenged, unabated, and the consequences of that reach far beyond just the immediate issues of transgender children. It reaches into the role of the state versus the parent, and become a wedge where, okay, the state is going to do some things with the kids, and the parent might not agree, so let's just leave the parent out of it. And you can
Mhm,
only imagine how a parent would feel if their child has been sort of guided along this ideological path, taught some premises that, only 10 years ago you would only hear from transgender activists,
mhm,
now that are in mainstream education. And all of a sudden, your kid's going by a different name, and maybe they're getting hormones and puberty blockers or whatever. And you just
mhm,
feel like an outsider to your own kid. And this was done to you by the state, by state-run
mm,
education. So this is
mhm,
a much bigger concern than just about those children. We should be concerned for those children, and the longer-term study suggests that sometimes people who are in conflicts about their gender, they feel like they're getting traction for the first few years, and then in the fifth to seventh year, they have a whole new set of problems now because of the transition, and whatever
mhm,
was there in the first place doesn't seem to be solved. But those
mhm,
studies are rare because they take a longer time and they reach a conclusion that is not as trendy, and some people would deny it even after they found it out anyway. So we will see more
mhm.
detransitioners. We will see more people coming forward saying, "Why didn't I get another perspective proposed to me?" And in this country, a lot of the reason is because of our media censorship and because of what the government did with C4 in banning conversion therapy.
Okay. But to be clear that, from my perspective, I think the parental rights movement has made a major difference across the country. When you have people, in my community, I just saw several hundred people again demonstrating over the Christmas holidays, saying that we don't want pornography in our schools, and that children are, the prerogative of parents, period, minors. And so, I don't know, I think it's hard to argue with that. And I think that the polls that have come out this year in 2023 are really revealing that some 80-90% of parents agree with that perspective. So I think any school board or provincial government or federal government, frankly, that doesn't hear that message really does so at their peril. So that's kind of my little summation on it. And I get it
I
that
won't
people may be
disagree.
confused about their gender, and our compassion goes out to them. But in the meantime, leave the kids alone, leave them to the parents. So I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time when it comes to these issues. So just because one says that my child is my child doesn't mean that they're not caring or intolerant of others that may be struggling with their gender. Anyway, so I think that's what I heard a lot from people actually at demonstrations. It was actually quite impressive. So, I
Oh,
think it's
yeah.
a very interesting question.
I don't argue with anything you're saying. I think it was encouraging that it happened and it needed to happen. And I don't know that they reached a million in the million person march, but it was in excess certainly of
Oh,
100,000 and maybe
huge.
more like 200,000. There were crowds all over
Yeah.
Canada. And this also
And
represents a broader cross section of people, which is nice. There was diversity, as they say, in this crowd. And
mhm,
we'll see how that plays out as far as political allegiances and things in the future, because a lot of those, the leftist parties have tried to appeal to minorities as we're for you, but then some of them are realizing that the values that they brought to this country are somewhat at odds with the leftist social values. And so that's
Exactly.
very
Well,
interesting.
and I think our colleague Michael Zagstra pointed out well that if people can't really hear each other's concerns across this issue of parental rights, the persons within the public school system do a lot of harm to the cause of public education. I think a lot of parents are moving towards home education. They're also demanding charter schools, like you see in Alberta, where people can set up a school as long as it meets certain standards. But I think inevitably this leads to the area of vouchers for schools. Why wouldn't you just give the money instead of giving the money to kind of a woke bureaucracy that doesn't listen? Why not just give it to parents and they choose where they send their child to the school that meets their choices? Do you see that
Absolutely.
traction picking up in
Absolutely.
Canada anywhere?
Well, I don't know how much it's picking up, but the don'tdeleteparents.ca website that came in response to support Premier Higgs in New Brunswick for his stance, and it was very, I don't want to say it was timid, it was principled, but it was very, it was pretty balanced. I mean, all they're saying there is that if you're less than 16 years old, the parents have to know about any kind of name change or pronoun change. And this was the thing for which there were massive fits by the other side, and unions calling the
Yeah.
parents fascists and all this sort of thing. I mean, this was a very,
Yeah.
very
Wow.
minimal kind of step. So it did need to happen. But one of the things, if you go to that don'tdeleteparents.ca website, you'll see they talk about the money following the student. So the parents, if they could just get that all the tax dollars that normally go to a student and say, we'll put it to whatever school we want, you could see a revolution overnight, because all of a sudden, all of the ones that say all of our traditional values are wrong, our inherited values, our Western values, they can't just take over the public school system and now you have an ideological hammer. No, parents will put their kids in the school that is giving the best results for the money. And it could be art schools, could be religious schools, could be, all kinds of things, because schools will start to compete, at least in urban areas, to get the students,
Mhm.
and it will make them the
No,
best.
I think
That's
you're
why
right.
markets work.
Yeah, I think that's right. And speaking of this diversity, inclusion,
Yeah.
equity kind of agenda with cultural Marxism, it's interesting how 2023 was definitely a year in terms of, dare I say, shedding a lot of light on the absurdity of these kinds of ideological arguments. I'll give you the example of the story of Dr. David Jacobs, who's waging an online campaign to get people to fill out the consultation form for a number of medical bodies that are proposing a radical insertion of diversity, equity, inclusion statements, political statements, if you will, so that doctors have to be concerned more with the politics of those statements rather than the healthcare of their patients. So, according to Dr. David Jacobs, and I'm reading an article here from Brian Lilly. He says, "Make no mistake, this is political. Social justice has come to define the political left by trying to supplant medical expertise with social justice. This small group of unelected doctors are trying to insert politics into the therapeutic relationship between a doctor and a patient." And I think that seemed to make a lot of sense. And he urges people to speak up and let the Royal College, the Association of Faculties of Medicine in Canada, or the College of Family Physicians of Canada, the College of Medicine of Quebec, and let them know what you think. I don't know. Do you think that that's a story? Are we peaking when it comes to wokeism or diversity, equity, inclusion in Canada, or is this just getting started as they go after not only physicians but including Dr. Jordan Peterson?
Oh, well, this is almost another aspect of the same thing we've been talking about. People want education without politics. They want business without
Mhm.
politics. They want
Yeah,
sports without politics, and they would like medicine without politics. Why can't we
indeed.
all just do our jobs? But this has become like a religion where you have to confess the
Right.
creed. At the start of every event, you have to confess the traditional lands of so and so. At every
Mhm.
decision by the medical board, we have to align with this and that. You have to go to the diversity, equity, inclusion in your corporate hiring, whatever. This has become the ideology that is imposed on every aspect of society, and in many ways, it's very anti-family. It is not and
Mhm.
anti-freedom for sure, because it is not allowing the
Right.
free choice of people on a whole host of issues that really should have nothing to do with these other aspects. And I think, to some extent, the kind of collusion that this represents should really raise people's eyebrows, because when you've got commerce and government and arts and education saying the same things, you've really got no field of influence that isn't being encompassed by this thing. So in the field of ideas, I don't think that their ideas stand. But when it comes to,
Mhm.
well, if we don't get this, we won't get funding. If we don't do this, whatever, it becomes sort of a bludgeon to make people comply.
Mhm.
And so we need to
No, I
recognize
think,
we're
I
being
think that's
wrestled.
right. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think another part of this whole DEI agenda, diversity, equity, inclusion, all these acronyms, has been really the revelations out of October 7. As you recall, a terrible day when the Hamas terrorist group attacked into Israeli territory and savagely murdered and killed so many people. And that associated war now that's come out of it, it's really a tragedy for everybody. But during that DEI, we saw really a fascinating response, a tragic one of so much anti-Semitism across Canada, around the world, and we saw so many universities really take up the cause of anti-Semitism. And we saw, of course, the most visible one was um, the panel testimony that was given at the U.S. Congress with, I believe it was the president of Harvard, um, Pennsylvania, and then also, of course, at MIT, and they really made fools of themselves. But it was really kind of like the mask was taken off of so many parties, and including in different Canadian universities where you had all kinds of really pretty hostile demonstrations of anti-Semitism in so many settings. And if you were a Jewish student, I don't know how you would feel comfortable, quite frankly, going to those schools. But so, is this tragedy of October 7 really revealed in your mind, Lee, in 2023, the challenges and the utter stupidity of the diversity, equity, inclusion agenda?
Uh, well, again, it's interesting. I mean, diversity, equity, inclusion should not have anything to do with a conflict in Palestine. But we do see a tremendous amount of overlap. And I think it's just another example of one big glob of a philosophy that all gets put together, where, uh,
Mhm.
you can have. It's basically everything against Western values, even if the things you're throwing against Western values conflict with each other. We'll just lay that aside for now and
Mm.
tear down the West, and then agree fight over what we build after it later.
Mhm.
I think if nothing, I do think there is a distinction between being anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish, uh, although it's the two are not so separated and so completely different either. And also, I think if nothing else, what we should get out of this is, if there's this much fighting across an ocean about this, how tense is it over there? What practical
Mhm.
realities are they dealing with over there? And so, um, this is not something that is going to ever easily be sorted out. And although might doesn't make right, might have to be the thing that prevails in one way or another. And that seems very ugly to me. I don't know if there's any real great solutions. It'd be great if everyone lived in peace, and all the people living in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip were willing to be, a full part of Israeli society. But at the same
Mhm.
time, when your goal is to have a Jewish state and they're not Jews, they're not Jews. So I mean, there's so many things here that just can't be reconciled, and
Yeah.
it's there's so many angles on it. So I do think it's regrettable. There have definitely been some statements of hatred that are um, depersonalizing and delegitimizing the state of Israel. And whether the state of Israel should have existed or whatever, the state of Israel does exist. Whether a baby should have been born, the baby is born.
Yeah,
And the Jews have made a
that's right.
state in Palestine. They have funded it. They have built it. They have made the desert bloom, and they should get to enjoy it.
Well, and let's hope that the parties can coexist. The challenge is that Hamas and its constitution says that Israel should not exist, and it should be exterminated. It should be driven into the sea, as they use that terrible phrase. So I think that's a quandary that we're not going to figure out today, but it is certainly one of the markers of 2023. That's for sure. One of the other things that I think is pretty stunning, and again, I'm talking to frontier researcher and author Lee Harding about key issues in 2023. What were the issues that come to your mind? We'd love to hear from you. So one of the questions I had was, did the Twitter files surprise you, Lee? We know about, I think what that question is getting at is when Elon Musk purchased Twitter, and I'm trying to recall when he actually purchased it and acquired it. I think it was in the beginning of 2023, if memory serves me correctly, although he did the purchase in 2022. But now Twitter's called X, and he clearly bought a crime scene. And what we've figured out is that based on the revelations of those files, and you remember he brought in a number of crack journalists like Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberg, among so many others, and they found out the direction that some 18 or more U.S. agencies had directed not just Twitter or X to censor on many different narratives, but across social media. I mean, this is, I think, a stunning revelation. Do you think that was one of the highlights in 2023?
Oh, definitely. It's a highlight to anyone paying attention. But again, if you're part of the mainstream media glob, how much attention are you paying, or how bad do you think it is? Or are you just going to, or is CNN just going to try and respin it and distort it into some kind of other thing other than what it is?
Yeah,
Yes, I mean,
right.
it is significant if you look at it and see what they were trying to do. I'm not surprised by it because this kind of collusion goes on, and the idea that people aren't what we've seen in the recent years is that they're getting much more bold. I mean, I'm sure that there was always
Yeah.
some bias in media, but at least they felt an obligation to share another side. Here it's cancel culture, where the left used to benefit from free speech because the majority was against their views. Now that they have the upper hand, and they've had 3 generations, at least in Western institutions, now the goal is to shut up everyone that doesn't agree with them and justify it by
Okay.
whatever it means. And that's what I think is going on. It's a shame. It shouldn't be happening. And I think fair-minded leftists should be also opposed to this, and people with no ideology should be opposed to this, and really get to the bottom of it and see what else is going on. So it's a very good thing
I
that
agree.
Elon Musk bought Twitter, and which he now called X. I don't know if that was a smart move or not, but X is going to mark the spot, and it's the one place we can find out things.
Well, and it is a home of, I think, generally free speech, which is really so foundational for a high functioning society where you can debate in a healthy way the search for truth. And, it's just incredibly foundational, not only to finding the truth, but prosperity, I would argue. If you can't, if there's always a political answer to things, then how would you ever discover anything that would enable your civilization to go forward? Maybe even a medical breakthrough or something that will be that new form of technology. So we can't take those things for granted. So in the meantime, in Canada, we noticed that I think another story in 2023 was the last 3 years we've seen government fund some 2,000 media outlets. A lot of people don't realize it's not just the large media outlets that are being funded, but even smaller ones, not the quote independent ones. So you really have to take a critical eye to that. But I think an interesting story in 2023, Lee, was in this past budget, the government again doubled down on funding these media outlets even more. Did that surprise you?
No, because the mainstream media is a rotting carcass and has become the Pravda of the West.
Whoa, a rotting carcass, Lee. What do you mean by that?
Well, it has lacked legitimacy because it has become so biased.
Mhm.
Its viewership is fading into it's basically a generation that latched onto it when it was a credible institution, is still watching. But for younger people, they either don't care, don't know, or aren't interested, or don't buy it. And so
Mhm.
out of when you have institutional rot, it might not be a carcass, but it is certainly eroding. And out of that, you need to have new growth. So the thing dies and you have some fertilizer in the ground. That's why independent
Yeah.
media is flourishing. And if the government got out of the way, it would flourish some more. But now we have a
Okay.
situation where the government, through its funding, I don't know why you would ever fund Facebook, or tax Facebook for directing people to news if you want to promote Canadian news. It's the dumbest thing ever. It's like punishing an
Yeah.
advertisement that worked. But the end result
Right.
is just as good for the Liberals because the mainstream media, which they fund
Yeah.
through the tax dollars, continues to be supported. And the upstart media, which is often online, that challenges the government. No one even sees the headlines now, can't have the headlines posted. So this is a big censorship experiment, and one that I don't know that Facebook is entirely opposed to, because if your
Mhm.
real goal is to mold the public as much as it is to make profits, we are in one big social experiment in Canada, and
Yeah.
it is taking
Exactly.
us down the toilet.
Yeah, I totally agree. So government needs to get the heck out of it, out of journalism, and let journalists do their job to speak truth to power. And yeah, no, this is a real mess. So, but it is interesting that you mentioned the independent media that is rising, that is thriving, but they seem to be attacking them again. It's interesting. I noticed that just today there was a announcement by Rebel News that the judge that was hearing a case regarding Ezra Levant's book from years ago called The Libranos, and I did read The Libranos. It was very interesting, and I don't mean this in a partisan way at all, but it was fascinating. The book was quite a well said analysis about the corruption of the Liberal Party at that time. And what was fascinating is, if memory serves me correctly, every single one of the sources for that book was taken from, get this, the CBC, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, that are well known advocates for the government of the day. And yet the judge, in his 80-page decision, said that this is somehow inappropriate to put this into the electoral period. So I'm still, I have not read the decision. I should qualify that in all fairness. But did that decision surprise you, that somehow he's getting, Ezra Levant, the author of this book called The Libranos, is getting paid, or pardon me, getting fined, I think, some $13,000?
No matter how bad anything gets, none of us should be surprised about anything, because we have World War II as an example.
Okay.
When I went to Yad
Yeah.
Vashem and saw the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, she said, "Remember, all of this happened in a democracy." So nothing should surprise us at all. And now, at the same time, if you're promoting a book with a sign that looks very much like an election sign during an election, the fact that a judge might conclude that this is, maybe not appropriate for an election period is not very far off. Whether it's correct or
Mhm.
not, it's within the realm of arguability, not like some of the other decisions that have come about for which we should
Mhm.
be really concerned.
Yeah. So people have to look into that, but it's certainly, these are all significant markers in 2023 around where is the basic rights and freedoms of our country going, whether it's freedom of speech or the independent media, to name so many other things. And speaking of World War II, it's interesting. I noticed that on Tuesday, on December the 26th, on Boxing Day, there was a passing of a very interesting person, and during 2023, we want to remember all the people who passed before us, so loved ones. And one of them was a woman named Maureen Flavin Sweeney, who lived from 1923 to 2023. And she was a very important person who watched the weather and influenced the D-Day plans on June 1944. And she was at an observations office in Ireland, and she carefully took the weather multiple times a day and relayed that to the weather office in London. And her report made a significant change. And she said they could arrange everything, but they couldn't prearrange the weather. We eventually had the final day, said Maureen Flavin Sweeney, who died December 17 at age 100. And as a result of her weather report, the D-Day invasion was delayed by 1 day. So she passed on, so God bless her. We also remember so many others who passed on, including, of course, Pastor Leon Fontaine, who passed away in November in 2023. It's hard to believe. So as we look at other stories, we want to hear from you as we get in the final stretch here. And I guess one of the stories I want to mention is has to do with the whole story of federal intrusion in provincial responsibilities. And I mean, there's just too many to mention, but when it comes to energy, that's a common pattern now that the federal government is undertaking, is going thoroughly into the provincial area of responsibilities. I think you have Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, and Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan speaking up about this. What do you think is going to happen in 2024 on these issues, Lee?
Oh, Canadians will decide. If they decided they've been beat up, haven't been beat up enough yet, they'll keep getting beat up. And if they've decided they've had enough, then we'll see an inevitable change of government. It's very hard. It's supposed to be very hard for a minority government to stay on longer than, I mean, the average is 18 months. They do have this supply agreement with the NDP, so that they're getting propped up. The NDP, well, they insist they're not broke, but that's what they're supposed to say. I don't think they really want to fight an election. They're in an ideal situation. They have the balance of power. They can claim credit for anything good the government's doing and wash their hands of everything bad the government is doing. So they'll never get elected nationally, and they're in the best position they could possibly be in right now. So this is their they want this train to go as far as the track can be laid to take it. So that's what's going to happen there. And as far as provincial intrusion, now thankfully we didn't eulogize Henry Kissinger, but Henry Kissinger was reported to have said, "The illegal we do right away. The unconstitutional takes a while longer." So I don't think Ottawa cares about what provincial jurisdiction is. They will just keep pushing whatever they want to do as long as they can. Just like Mr. Davey, the Liberal strategist, said in 1980, screw the West, we'll take the rest. They've won the last two elections without winning the popular vote. So why would they care about what Alberta and Saskatchewan think? Because why would a resource-based economy ever agree with Ottawa? So they are going to put down the screws and do it every way they can. And thankfully, the judges gave a few decisions to say you are overreaching. And that's welcome. That's nice. And they do have to abide by that. And they will they will somewhat abide by it, and they'll somewhat regroup to come at their goals another way. So that's what I think.
Wow. Okay, so Lee, audience, please tell us, is Lee being too cynical? Does he have it right on? What do you say? So I do have a question here, and that is, do you think governments will realize that they need to open up land to solve the housing affordability issue? Will they ever figure it out? I think that's the question.
Well, it almost seems like government creates the solutions that it imposes for the problems it imposes solutions to, which also create further problems that they have further solutions to, until we're so far off that it's almost beyond recognition. So Frontier's done very good work at this. Wendell Cox has done very good work on this, that
Yes, indeed.
40, 50 years ago, you had basically your average mortgage was going to be 3 times the cost of your annual income. There's very few places left like that. Where I'm living in Regina is close to that because it's flat in all directions and you can just keep expanding. But
Yeah.
in some places you have limits because you butt up against another urban jurisdiction or Vancouver, there's mountains close by or what have you. It's not always an option, but governments like to make rules. They want to stop the urban sprawl because apparently that's the trendy thing. And that's why we have housing costs that are so high here, and also why it's a real problem when the mortgage rates and the lending rates go up, because so much of our wealth is based on that, that it becomes a very, very big factor in ways that it wouldn't in other places. So I think that, here, I'll give you an example. When I lived in Victoria, I met a housing developer. He said they tried repeatedly to get a development built. They went through the various aspects of municipal governance. This one rubber stamp, but this one, and then there'd be one that didn't. Well, how can we please you? Oh, well, you just do this. Okay, so they would do that, resubmit. That part of it would be pleased, the other one wouldn't. They spent $500,000 and they gave up because they could not they could not meet the requirements of all these various things. But then what happens? Oh, probably local government comes along and says, those big bad capitalists, they don't want to have anything built because they're so greedy, but we're going to come along and we're going to have all this housing. And what does the government do? They do everything through your tax dollars and through paying people to do what they do.
Right.
So in the end, they take money from you to say they're doing for you what you could have done in the first place, and that's government.
Right. So it's really quite ironic, and I think we've done kind of a almost a comical summary and reflection of this mess, is that the government has created this mess of housing unaffordability, and then they don't.
Sorry, but how does the country with the largest landmass in the world, why do we have to prevent urban sprawl? Why are we fighting global warming?
Yeah.
When there's been a study done that I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago, Memorial University in Newfoundland with some Chinese scientists, the arable land goes north. We would be the biggest winners through global warming.
Yes.
We could just grow land north and you could expand the cities all you wanted down here because you got all this land that you can grow.
Right.
Oh, we might have to cut a tree down. Well, fine. The trees will grow further north and you start planting up there. You won't even have to. The forests will spread by themselves.
Yeah, no, and so this is the contradiction. And then on top of that, the immigration numbers, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, are massive. They've never been seen in terms of these record numbers before. So the $1 million influx of immigrants coming in the country is just truly breathtaking. And I see this on the ground as we go from different cities across the country. And I also see this in terms of the kind of the attitudes that you hear from many Canadians. They're truly getting tired of this. In fact, yesterday an Abacus data poll just came out that, and this is looking at lower income percentiles of Canadians. These are people that have an average or below average income. And this was in the case of renters, Lee. It's fascinating. 80% of those renters responded, said that they are very worried, not just a little bit, but worried about losing their rental property because they see rents going up so high. 80%. Also in that group, there are also some homeowners, and 57% again are very concerned they will lose their home in 2024 as their mortgages come to renew. So that is not a good scene. I think it's already a crisis in a number of markets where housing is not affordable. But with the kind of initiatives that are coming out by the government, these are not going to make any difference. At least that's what I'm seeing in terms of the kind of analysis on these issues, because they're not really dealing with the real issue, which is opening up land for development. So, man, there's so many other issues.
Let's remember that Latin phrase, qui bono, who benefits. You know,
Who
it's like the
benefits?
depression. The depression was terrible, but it was great for anyone who had wealth. You could buy
Yeah.
properties at 5 cents on the dollar. So the
Mhm.
bankers didn't release the money supply, and there was no money to do anything with, and a few people were positioned to benefit from it. So
Yeah.
what happens when Canadians can't afford their homes? I don't know if
Mhm.
Vanguard and BlackRock can so easily buy here as they can in the United States, but we could have companies that just buy up all the properties,
Mhm.
and then we have another means of increasing serfdom, because you have
Mhm.
a nation of owners and a massive majority of renters. And so and then the new homes that get built, they probably have to be green with all of these new regulations, to do anything. So, I mean, there's all kinds of ways that this can go together, and it should be a concern. Not everyone needs to own their own home. Home ownership is not a right, but
Mhm.
we want to have it in a position where it becomes a feasible goal in a person's lifetime if that's what they want. And
Indeed.
I know one person, when the 40-year mortgages were on, he says, I don't know what's going to happen first. I die, I pay off this mortgage, or the Indian Act is revoked.
Wow. Okay. Well, as we wrap things up, pardon me, let's think about hope a little bit. And one of the things I've been so impressed by is the level of citizen action by Canadians. And I've seen this on many files. We saw this, of course, on what people choose to buy, whether they choose to buy from a woke company or product. I think of Bud Light as an example. As I checked the states, the figures in the United States, by the way, on this yesterday, um, pardon me, we find that the sales for Budweiser Light are still down a staggering 30%. So how is that for citizen action? The other thing that I found interesting was, of course, the parental rights movement across the country. And I think also we've seen this in terms of a variety of people realizing that we have a choice in terms of how we speak up on different issues, and contacting your representative is important. There are some that will not listen, but it's important to speak up. Otherwise, you're creating silence begets a sense of approval. So, where do you look for hope, Lee?
Jesus Christ, the only Lord and Savior, but that's not FCPP policy, so I don't know what we can do.
Okay,
I
so but
think
your
that we
faith
can
is
look at.
very important.
Well, no matter how dark it gets, I know the light is going to shine, and we will kick the darkness until it bleeds daylight, and that's our role. No one can take away our freedom of speech. They can only take away our platform. The only person that can keep our mouth shut is ourselves. And so we can speak, we can act within whatever realm of influence that we have, and that will always be available to us. And I think that Canada is waking up, and I think that just ahead we are going to have the time where we truly shine, not only at home but on the world stage. Conrad Black, when he was at the Frontier event in the spring in Winnipeg, maybe that was June or early summer, he said this country could, basically he said it could turn on a dime. He says it looks bad now, we're not in a good direction, but we have so much that we're blessed to work with, that with the right leadership, things could look a lot brighter, a lot faster. I think we need, when there's a change of government, whenever that happens, we need an omnibus bill that says everything that happened the last 8 years, we're just going to get rid of. The same way that Trudeau got rid of everything Harper did that he could, we're going to simplify the tax code. We're going to take off gender based language requirements out of every pipeline application, and all this other stuff that is just, we are so smothered under the bureaucracy. I mean, it's a wonder we can even breathe underneath it, but they want to tax the breath too with the carbon tax. um, I mean, I have hope because uh, we are not powerless. We do still live in a democratic country, and the people still have wealth and power to leverage against these things. And if we only stand up to do what we always could have done, we will find that things look a lot different. So I think our era to shine is just ahead. I think that it will probably eventually give way to another change of government and a technocracy and this and that and whatever else. But we have got a real time to shine, and it's going to be glorious, and it is just ahead. I really do believe
All
that.
right. Well, thank you for your statement of optimism, Lee, and for your opinions today on a variety of topics. We really appreciate your leadership and hard work uh, as a researcher at Frontier and as an author in so many publications. And we're glad as well that the audience could join us today live on both YouTube and X. And we look forward to your continued comments and share this with your friends and family. And also be sure to subscribe to the Frontier Center newsletter. Be sure to look at the website and join us every Thursday at 2 o'clock Central Time, noon Pacific, and 1 o'clock Mountain Time, and of course, 3 o'clock Eastern. And we can go right across the country. We have so many people joining us. And one of the things I'm very excited to tell you is that next week we're going to have John Carpe, the president of the Canadian Justice Center, join us, and we'll be talking about all kinds of legal cases that relate to you in terms of your freedom and your rights. So in the meantime, we want to wish every one of you a great and prosperous 2024, and be sure to be involved and be active as Canadian citizens. And thank you for joining us for this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me today. A few final notes. One is that the COP is the Conference of the Parties, and the Just Transition is a slogan, just like the way the Just Society was a slogan. And they'll just take away whatever from you as they make you go green. So that is that. Maybe we'll talk again next year.
All right. Thank you very much, Lee, and thank you everyone for joining us.